The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host.
Hello, and welcome to the Democracy That Delivers podcast. My name is Michelle Crimes, and I am the Deputy Director for CIPE's Anti-Corruption and Governance Center. And I am joined here today by Sabrina Segal, and we're going to have a conversation about something that is near and dear to my heart and my professional capacity, which is compliance in humanitarian aid organizations. So before I talk a little bit more sort of about the context, I want to turn it over to Sabrina to introduce herself. Welcome, Sabrina.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast today. I'm really excited to be here and talk about risk and humanitarian work. I can tell a little bit about myself. So I am a risk and compliance professional. I'm a lawyer by training, but don't hold that against me. I've been in, thank you, the international development and humanitarian sector for almost 20 years now, doing everything from handing out blankets and biscuits and buckets in refugee camps to working at headquarters for large, both private and third sector organizations focusing on international development programming as well as humanitarian programming. And for the past few years, I've sort of transitioned into the risk and compliance area because like I like to say about third sector organizations, risk is not new to these organizations, but all of the requirements that donors have been placing on these organizations recently is quite novel. So having to really structure and formalize and report out on the risk awareness and risk management that they sort of do naturally is a little bit unnatural to them. So I work trying to support third sector organizations, mostly small to medium sized, low to no resource charities and nonprofits, improve their integrity, risk, and compliance environments. So looking forward to our conversation today.
I'm looking forward to this as well. And just to give our listeners a little bit of the context, I think you set this up really well. One of the reasons the team here at CIPE is really interested in one of the reasons the team here at CIPE is really interested in working on this issue, and we've dedicated lots of time to talking about compliance and anti-corruption in what Sabrina, I think, wonderfully calls the third sector, and I'd like to dig into that a little bit, is that we know that there are many conflict zones, post-conflict zones. In the past, I would say 3 years since 2020, we've just seen a lot, sort of this increase in uptick in humanitarian aid, in crises. And so what we here at CIPE have been doing is we've noticed there's a large influx of funding that goes into a country. And we started to get very curious about what does that mean for the organizations that receive that humanitarian aid, the funds for humanitarian aid. What does it mean for the communities? And we started engaging in a really interesting dialogue around what that means, creating a tool to be helpful to humanitarian aid organizations and charities. And this conversation is an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper, I think, with someone like Sabrina, who really brings a wealth of experience to this. So I'll just go ahead and get started into the questions. One of the things that I think would be interesting, if you wouldn't mind talking about just a little bit, is that on our end here at CIPE, we often say humanitarian aid organizations or charities, but you always refer to it as the third sector. Would you mind sort of helping us to understand what the third sector means for you, just so that our listeners can understand? I think we're on the same page about it, but I think it's a really interesting way that you talk about it, and I'd love to hear more of your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So the third sector is essentially not the private sector and not the government sector. It's charities, it's nonprofits. It can be, depending on how they're structured and where they work in, is philanthropic foundations, things like that. But what's really interesting about the third sector and risk is that the third sector only exists because the government sector and the private sector have abandoned whatever it is that they need, that third sector organization is serving. So, it's these underrepresented under-recognized, really, communities or challenges that are facing society, but the government has, not been able to step in and support a solution or is choosing not to. And it's of no interest to the private sector, frankly, because maybe there's just no money to be made there. So charities and nonprofits are basically working in these crevasses, so to speak, spaces within our society that are inherently risky because everybody else is not there and has abandoned them. So when you look at charities and nonprofits, everyone kind of likes to think about the warm fuzzies. You're helping animals, you're helping elderly people, you're, talking about climate change and things like that. Everybody sort of paints the humanitarian or the charity worker as somebody who has their heart on their sleeve and really leads with their passion. All of those things are true. But the environment that we work in is absolutely inherently risky. You would not need a charity if a government entity or if a private sector entity was serving that under-recognized population or that under-recognized need. So the third sector, really we deal with risk all the time, every day in, day out, from the moment that an entity is created or a group comes together to try and serve a community. Until, we either grow really big, like some of the big INGOs that you hear about, in the media, or maybe just a small community organization that's been around for 100 years or so. So that's what the third sector is. And when people think about charities and nonprofits now, I hope your listeners will also really acknowledge the risky environments that they are constantly working in, no matter what their mission and their purpose is.
Thank you for really digging into that a little bit so that we can all, one, be on the same page and have, I think, what I hope is a more sort of expansive understanding of the third sector and what it is that we're really talking about. One of the things that you've mentioned quite a few times, wonderfully, and just now, is risk and sort of the risk that is happening in the third sector. If someone is out there listening and they're wondering, well, we would like to be, let me start that over. If someone is out there listening to us and is wondering how to address the issue of risk, how do they understand what their risks are, or maybe even how they communicate the risk to someone? What are some steps that you might recommend they take to help to identify that risk? And how does that change given their local context or the individual context of their subject matter?
Sure. So I am a practitioner of what's called objective-centered risk management. Now, I want to caveat my answer going forward saying, look, if you work in an aerospace engineering company or a petrochemical or a pharmaceutical company, you're obviously going to have quite tight and strict kind of risk protocols around what you do. My point of view that I come from is the third sector. Again, charities, nonprofits, and typically low to no resource charities and nonprofits. Now, that being said, I have actually talked to a lot of small to medium-sized commercial enterprise organizations, private sector companies, who really like the objective-centered approach as well, because it really links to project management, and it's quite practical. And really, it links to the objectives of the organization and decision making. A lot of the tools that are out there for risk management right now, including risk matrices, risk registers, risk appetite statements, frankly, in my point of view, are a real waste of time. They don't directly link to decision making. They don't directly link to objectives. And it's really something that organizations will spend a lot of time spinning their wheels and coloring in little red, yellow, and green boxes. But at the end of the day, it's not going to help you manage risk. So where I start with objective-centered risk management is exactly as it says on the tin, with the objectives. So the nice thing about objective-centered risk management is that it scales really well. You can either apply this to your organizational strategic objectives. You can apply it to departments or teams or units. You can even apply this to your own individual objectives, performance plan that you do every year within your organization. Because where the analysis starts is the objective. So you put the objective right at the middle, and then you ask yourself, what will prevent me from achieving my objective, or what will enhance my achievement of my objective? I function under the ISO 31000 definition of risk, which is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. I like that definition. Number one, it's only 6 words. Number two, it's not positive or negative. It's quite neutral. Because one of the things that I talk about with risk is a coin with 2 sides. One side is threats, and that's the side that we often think about when we talk about risk. Everything is negative, everything's on fire, alligators are going to fall from the sky, whatever it is. But the other side of the coin is opportunity. And unfortunately, in sort of kind of current day risk management tools and approaches, we don't talk enough about those opportunities. In the charity sector, we have to talk about those opportunities, or else we'll never be able to get anything done. So after you put your objective in the middle, you then ask yourself on one side of that objective, what's going to prevent me from achieving this objective? And on the other side of it, you say, what is going to enhance my achievement of this objective? And let me give you an example from a charity point of view. Let's say you want to run a children's literacy program. And, your objective is to reach X number of children or, improve their ability to read against a baseline test that you've done at the beginning of the activity. Your threats obviously will be getting the kids to come back, finding a facility that can host the children, being able to ensure that you have the right number of teachers, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the opportunities might actually be that program that you're running is so incredibly popular in the community that you have more people that sign up and more children that want to participate than you originally planned. What a wonderful problem to have. So we want to also think about, well, look, if we have that opportunity that presents itself while we're trying to achieve this objective, how can we then address that? So that kind of takes us to the third step. Once you've mapped out your threats and your opportunities, you then ask yourself, what are the causes? And each one of those causes may link to, one or multiple threats or one or multiple opportunities. I like to do this as a modified mind map. I use sticky notes and paper, or you can do it on a Miro board. You put your opportunity in the middle, and then you put your threats and opportunities around that, sort of in a concentric circle, and you draw lines. And then from there, around that, in another circle, you put your causes. And again, it allows for a many-to-many linkage, which visually really helps people to do their planning, as opposed to having a risk register, which is quite, A to B. It's really linear. It doesn't allow for that many-to-many connectivity. And again, it's not very useful for decision making. So you ask yourself, what are the causes of the threats and the opportunities? And then after that, you say, what are my preparation steps? So that's your last concentric circle around the outside. And again, you may have preparation steps that link to one or many of your causes. And you ask yourself, what are the preparation steps that I need to put in place so I can address the causes, so that I can either prevent the threats or enhance the opportunities so I can achieve my objective. So you can see how we have these concentric circles, and again, it always comes back to the objective. So in the opportunity example that I gave, one of the preparation steps that we may be able to do to address an opportunity where our literacy program is very popular is we may be able to find other organizations in the community that we could quickly reach out to, make sure that they're trained up, make sure that, they can then take the overflow children that are interested in participating in this, make sure we have enough materials printed out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that we can quickly pivot, adjust, and accelerate so that we can reach as many people as we can with this particular program. So the nice thing about objective-centered risk management, again, is that everybody is sitting on the same side of the table, and we want to achieve this objective. And so it really integrates risk into your program development. It integrates risk into your project management, and it doesn't make it something that is this add-on. I like to say risk needs to be built in, not bolted on. And by taking this kind of approach, you really genuinely are building it in to everything that you're doing, your organizational ways of working, and it's not an afterthought.
I think you just gave a fantastic answer to the question for anyone who might be wondering, well, what do I do and how do I do it? I think one of the reasons we were so excited when we had an opportunity to have a conversation a few months ago when we first met was that a lot of the, I think, lessons learned specifically from SMEs, small, medium, and maybe even micro entrepreneurs, some of the challenges that we might see in the private sector, you might see also, I think, with smaller third sector or nonprofit or charitable organizations. So I think hopefully if we have listeners who are, clicked because they're interested in learning, I think you just gave a wealth of knowledge about how to approach it, about how to approach this issue.
Yeah, and
I
Michelle,
think
just so you know, I'm happy to, people can, reach out to me and I'm happy to provide the materials that I have. This is a really simple approach that you can do. Again, I said with sticky notes and paper or a Miro board, and then with an Excel spreadsheet to track your objectives at the end. You don't need fancy software. You don't need heavy quantitative tools. It really is, a very simple approach that can be done to give you a good steer. And I think you're absolutely right. Small and medium-sized enterprises and micro enterprises could absolutely use this approach as well.
And I think one of the things that might be a question for someone who is thinking about this is, but why? Do you know what I mean? We've talked about this is the risk. They might think, well, it's just me and two other folks. Why would we do this? We don't have the money to do this. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about, what we might discuss as the business case here, or I think you could even say the rationale. And how would you, if you've got someone who is your funder, how do you convince them that this is important and that we ought to allocate not all resources, but a certain amount of resources to ensuring that we've addressed the potential risk in our operations?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. It's sort of a two-part question. Let me say the first answer is the why. Well, in the humanitarian side of the house, the why is we want to be able to reach more people with sometimes life-saving, resources, depending on what it is that the program is trying to achieve. Even from the development side of the house, we want to be able to reach these communities to help support, stabilization after a crisis, or to help build stronger, more resilient communities. So the reason why this risk awareness and risk management approach is so crucial is because, again, third sector organizations have very limited resources, and we want to make sure that we're using our resources in the most efficient and effective way. Therefore, being able to map out to the best of our ability, where our opportunities are to reach even more people and where our threats might be that will, prevent us from achieving those objectives is really essential. It's an essential part of the planning process. Now, when it comes to donors and funders, like I said in the beginning, a lot of your larger multilateral and bilateral donors and funders, governments, the government's UN, even some of the larger private foundations, again, are asking organizations to demonstrate that not only are they a responsive partner, and by being responsive, I mean that they are running the types of programs that these funders are interested in. Again, is it an environmental program? Is it for children? Is it for animals? Whatever it is. So not only that they are a responsive partner, but also that they are a responsible partner. And that is where integrity, risk, compliance all come in. Funders want to make sure that the money that they're giving is going to achieve these objectives, and being able to very clearly tell that story with some data and analysis that you've done really helps to build, that relationship of trust with donors. But again, it also helps to show that not only are you responsive with your programming, but you're responsible. Now, if we're talking about donors, I am going to hold, if there's any donors that are listening right now, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire a little bit. Unfortunately, what has been happening recently around compliance is it's been kind of a box tick exercise. It's been a lot of what I like to call risk theater and not really a whole lot of risk application. Donors will say, show me your safeguarding policy, show me your fraud policy, tick, tick, tick. We tick these boxes and we move forward. Just because you have a policy in place doesn't actually mean that you're managing risk. Just because you've done a risk matrix doesn't mean that you're managing risk. And so, I think that there has to be a real kind of ground truthing conversation among the third sector saying what really genuinely is going to demonstrate that we are a responsible partner. Is it going to be these endless checklists and having to hire more compliance people than actual program implementation people because the donors continue to have these very heavy compliance environments that don't really make much sense at all? Or can we revisit this and have a real conversation about what does compliance genuinely mean And is there a way that we can do it that is maybe slightly different than the more quote unquote traditional way that it's been done? This could be a game changer for the third sector. It could free up a lot more resources and allow a lot more impactful programming. But, it's a conversation that I think we're on the cusp of having, but we haven't quite had yet.
So I just want to say again that I really feel that risk theater is something that I will be saying quite a bit going forward, and I will always remember to credit you for that. But I think it's a wonderful way to sort of describe the sort of busy work that can suddenly come out of compliance. And I think when we think about it in sort of our area where we focus mostly with SMEs or small businesses, right? People just want access to what they need. And I think about the parallel to that in the third sector and sort of how that can turn into what you've described as risk theater in both sectors who are really just trying to achieve an objective, which is really having a great impact on their communities, providing for their family, providing support for their community. And this idea that we need to think about the fact that smaller organizations in particular, and I think overall in general, third sector, from your perspective, there might be a different approach that can help us to better use our resources. So I'm looking forward to following your discussion on that because I think it is a really important discussion to have, not just for the third sector, but I also think for SMEs and for the private sector, specifically in places that are high risk and where we want to see economies grow and we want to see communities be able to thrive. I think one of the things that I sort of want to switch a little bit in, because I think you've talked a little bit about sort of donors, private sectors. Well, I asked you about it and you talked about it. One of the things that is really interesting to me is to talk about sort of how the private sector connects with the third sector and some of the ways that we can work effectively between the private sector and in our different contexts. I think the work that SIPE does is a perfect example of that. We are taking some really wonderful private sector lessons learned and we hope providing some sort of support to the third sector. But I wonder if you have any other ideas about how aid that might come from or assistance that might come from the private sector might be designed to help. And I'll leave it at that so that you can answer the question.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked this question, Michelle, because this is a super, super, super important thing. And I do go to a lot of conferences and have been on a few other podcasts talking about this very specific issue about how the private sector can work well with the third sector. And I think, for your audience, this is going to be hopefully really helpful. A lot of private sector organizations have, spun off foundations or they sponsor, local charities. They allow their staff to volunteer, for, a few hours a year or a month or whatever it is. They do fundraising for specific charities. They may even fund specific grants for activities and things like that. All of that is fantastic. We desperately need more private sector engagement in third sector activities. Again, like I said in the beginning, it's pretty much because the government and the private sector aren't engaging in some of these topics that the third sector exists and is doing the type of work that it's doing. Now, that being said, it's really important for the private sector when they say that they want to partner with these third sector organizations, that they genuinely come at it from a partnership point of view. And when I say that, I mean, if you're going to partner with a charity, don't ask them to go through your vendor due diligence process. They're not a vendor. They're not going to have the same, again, policies and procedures and internal controls and all the things that you would expect a vendor to have. Partner with them. Sit down. Talk to them. Ask them, what do they need in order to achieve the objectives that you both jointly want to achieve? Ask them how, you can support their internal operations. Ask them how you can fund their overhead. There's this philosophy right now going around, it's been going around for a while, that, if charities ask for money to cover their rent or, God forbid, the salaries of their staff, somehow they're a bad charity. We have to move away from that misconception. If you want a good quality product that is coming out the other end, you've got to put good quality things in. So supporting that local charity by funding, them to be able to buy upgraded laptops, being, funding somebody to come in and help them secure their network. If your company does IT support, not only do you want to support the charity down the street that's helping out with stray animals, but why don't you go into that office and say, hey, can some of my staff help you with IT support on a pro bono basis? You will be able to knock them over with a feather, because so many of these organizations run on the sweat and the tears and shoestring budgets to get the operational stuff done, because they want as much of their resources to go towards the programming. They genuinely are trying to do that. So, when you're working with these charities, not only think about, again, the programming that you want to support, but think about how you can support them as an entity as well. There's a saying that a rising tide floats all boats. If you fund or support, one or two programs that a charity is running, that's great. You're going to support the beneficiaries and participants that are receiving the benefits of that activity or that program. But if you fund and support the organization itself, you're going to be supporting all of the programs and all of the beneficiaries and all of the recipients that organization is touching. Now, I know that, it might not be as glamorous to give you, a photo op of handing a toy to a child, but I guarantee you that it's going to be so much more impactful if you run a small accounting firm and you offer that charity pro bono accounting services, or if you run a small law firm and you offer that charity pro bono legal services, whatever it is. If you run an auditing firm or an IT support firm or a PR firm or a marketing firm, or you do graphic design, whatever it is, they will be thankful to have that service as much as they'll be thankful to have your monetary donation. So, think about this when it comes to risk. They're not necessarily going to be able to pass your vendor due diligence and all of that, but don't approach them that way. Approach them genuinely as a partner with the objective of whatever it is you want to achieve in that community, and then walk forward with them hand in hand. Build that relationship, build that sense of trust, understand that there's a power dynamic there. They're going to want to make you happy because you are giving them that resource, but also let them know that it's okay for them to come to you with challenges and, threats that they've identified, and that you're going to work together as partners. And you're not just going to say, oh, well, you can't account for every last dollar that I gave you, and walk away. That's really what they're the most scared of. And I think that it's possible to do that, but we really have to be aware of that power dynamic, aware of the relationship when the private sector is working with the third sector.
I think that's a great sort of way of laying out what is sort of happening in the dynamic here. You've mentioned the power dynamic between the third sector and potential private sector actors who may be collaborating. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how does that power dynamic inform the risk tolerance in particular? I think you touched on it very lightly, but I'd love to hear a few more of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the donor that you're working with. If you're working with a really large private sector company, think about, I don't know, any of the large consulting firms, or a large bank, or, a large, whatever, Fortune 500, Fortune 100, or, any company that's even traded, a larger organization. These smaller charities are thrilled to have those organizations knocking on their door. They're also petrified. They are absolutely scared out of their minds, because, again, that is such a great opportunity to have a longer term relationship, to have more regular resourcing coming in over maybe a multi-year grant or a multi-year relationship. But again, these larger organizations tend to have heavier compliance requirements. And so, if somebody from a larger organization is listening today, or even a medium size, again, remember, as I said in the very beginning, any charity or nonprofit that you are going to partner with is functioning in already in an elevated risk environment because of the type of work that they're doing. Full stop. They're doing work in a space that's been abandoned by the government and the private sector. So everything they do is going to have something of a risk. So you need to be aware of, the volume of risk that you are willing to take on. And you also need to accept that on your end, and don't try and make the small charity or nonprofit fit your vendor or your very heavy compliance environment. If you want somebody that's going to fit your heavy compliance requirement, then go find a larger organization. But those larger organizations don't necessarily have access to the under-recognized communities that you may want to reach. And so it really is a balancing act. One of the things that I talk a lot about when we're talking about risk is, everybody has their quote unquote risk appetite or their risk profile, that they're willing to kind of move towards or work within. What I think we need to do is look at the risk of the activity or the project itself and give that activity or project some sort of risk measurement. And then you as an entity can say, yeah, you know what, I'm willing to take on that risk and accept it and move forward. And then if that risk happens, you have something in place that you've already said you're willing to accept that risk. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is these large donors come in to these projects and something goes wrong. Something always goes sideways, again, because you're working in these unstable environments. And, if you can't account for, $500 worth of a grant, or if there is fraud, if there is corruption, if there are bribes that had to be paid in order to get the program done, then the funder gets all upset and, demands that everything is paid back or walks away or starts to really smear the reputation of the organization that they were partnering with. All of these things could be addressed up front by both the funder and the implementing partner agreeing on the risk measurement of the project they're trying to achieve, and everybody saying, I'm willing to take that risk, which means that if something goes sideways, the funder is going to stand by the project and say, yes, I was aware that this risk may happen, and I still stand by it because these are the things that we discussed in the beginning. Now, it doesn't mean that the charity or nonprofit is just going to turn a blind eye to fraud or allow corruption to happen. Of course not. These are things we want to address, but donors need to acknowledge that this is going to happen and not clutch their pearls and say, oh, I couldn't have possibly imagined that this was going to happen, and then walk away. That is where we start to move into these toxic relationships between donors and implementing partners, and that's where everything falls apart.
I think you really touched upon what we've talked about quite a bit before, which is sort of the knee-jerk reaction that might happen from corruption that is discovered. And certainly my positioning, and I think we agree, is that when it comes to corruption and things that might happen, fraud, it's not zero tolerance in terms of it might happen, because ultimately it does and it can happen. It's more about what happens afterwards, what's in place to address it. And I think you've really set up a wonderful context in between how a donor and honestly, any organization might think this through. How are we going to work on these issues after we discover them? What is our approach? How do we work together? And these are, I think, really important. Maybe a continuation conversation, or perhaps that we can have on this.
Yeah, exactly, Michelle. I just want to add zero tolerance. If I could take those two words out of, the lexicon, I would be so happy to. The phrase zero tolerance, it actually, while you think it might strengthen your perception of anti-fraud and anti-corruption, all it does is create an environment of real anxiety for people to speak up and speak out. So, don't hang your hat on zero tolerance. It doesn't actually do what you think it does.
I agree with you on that 100%. So we're in different sectors having the same conversation. And maybe as we continue to have more conversations, it becomes clear to people and to our listeners why we take that approach. It's never zero tolerance. It's what do we do afterwards? That goes for the third sector and for the private sector. Sabrina, I want to thank you so much for joining us today to have this conversation. I hope that our listeners have learned a little bit more about the third sector, risks that come from the third sector, and we've had a little bit of a conversation about how the private sector can talk with the third sector and talk through risk, and hopefully this leads to some wonderful initiatives for anyone who might be listening. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's been great being on the show.
Listen and subscribe to SIPE's Democracy That Delivers wherever you get your podcasts.